Hey everyone, if you can hear me, let me know. It's Naja Young. Greetings, everyone. Greetings, greetings, greetings. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, depending on where you are. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a moment. Going to let a few people come on in. This is Naja Young. I'm a filmmaker for those of you all who don't know. And October is, of course, Hoodoo Heritage Month. So this month, what we're going to be talking about is the significance of names and naming ceremonies within the African American culture, from Kemet to Kemeisha. Okay. So we're going to break that down today. We're just waiting for some more people to come on in. If not, it's no, never mind, because we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, this is meant to be a discussion and not a lecture because people pay me to lecture, and that's not what we're here to do. But what I am here to do is to let you guys know or just bring some things to your attention as it relates to naming cultural practices of African Americans. And I say this because um, sometimes people like to say that Black folks don't have any culture, especially in the United States. Now, when we look at Black people or people from um, the African diaspora all over the world, we look at them and we are envious of their different cultures, their music, their language. Some people are even envious of their skin tone, hair color, or um, their dance styles. But when I look at some Black Americans, even those of us who consider ourselves to be the most conscious of Black Americans, we are always sitting back. Um, not all of us, but some of us are sitting back going, oh my God, we don't have any culture here in the United States. And that is, in fact, a lie. We have lots of culture here in the United States. And so Hey, Brandon Javon, thank you for joining me. Brandon, can you do me a favor? If you have TikTok or anything like that, please go ahead and post this link there and ask people to meet us there. For those of you all who don't know, Brandon is my trusty assistant, who is AKA my real boss on all situations. So go ahead and do that for me, Brandon. I'm only allowed to post on one platform right now. So I want to talk to you all about African American naming customs and cultural traditions, because we do have our own customs and cultural traditions in the United States. And those traditions and customs are rooted in African, African traditional naming customs and systems. And so, what do I mean by that? Here's what I want to say, and this is very important. So, I want you all to kind of really take this in. When Africans were enslaved and brought against their will to the Americas or to any other there we are. I'm back. So, what I need for people to understand and and go with me on is that when Africans were enslaved and brought to the United States, making sure my do not disturb is on, y'all. Because even if I tell people that, hey, I'm going live at this time, folks love to call, but they can just leave a message. So, what's important for you all to understand is when Africans were enslaved and brought to the United States, we had names, we had our own cultures, we had our own spiritual belief systems, we had our own astronomers, we had our own healers, we had our own agricultural practices. We were not just a people who had nothing. And let me say this, we were multiple peoples because Blackness is not a monolith. There are over 2,000 different ethnic groups in Africa. You may be familiar with the term tribe, right? So a tribe is nothing more than an ethnic group. A tribe is what's given to people who are not white. When we refer to French people, Spanish people, Moldavians or whatever, we don't say, oh, they're from the Spanish tribe. We refer to them as their culture. So what, or an ethnic group. So I want to make sure that we are giving Africans that same due respect. Feel me? So we're talking about over 2,000 different ethnic groups indigenous to the continent of Africa, each one having their own spiritual practices or religious systems, each one having their own language, um, each one having their own customs and instead of mores. So we have to see that. So when Africans were enslaved and brought to ports around the world, not just the Americas, but also some of us were taken east to work in the Arabias or to even work in other parts against our will in other parts of Africa. It's important to note that we came with our own cultural practices. Okay. And if you're here, say hello, hit like, hit share, invite other people to join the conversation. We came with our own cultural practices. Okay. So, when my ancestors were brought here from the motherland, from Africa, they came with their own naming systems, customs, languages, and more than one ethnic group was brought to the Americas. So, you had people who were Yoruba, you had people who were Fon, you had people who were Wolof, you had people who were all these different ethnic groups. And these ethnic groups, a lot of times, spoke different languages. And so, coming to the US or coming to any part of the Americas or even East, going to Saudi Arabia, Iran, or any of these places, we had to learn to adapt to come up with a common tongue that we could speak with one another, whether that be learning the colonizer or the enslaver's tongue, and when I say tongue, I mean language, or coming up with something on our own. Sometimes those things are called pidgin, right? It's a trade language, it's a pidgin language, it's a mixture of multiple languages from people from different ethnic groups, right? So we come here to the United States. We had our own practices for giving our children names. That didn't dissipate when our ancestors were brought on those slave ships. We brought those customs, those cultures, those spiritual practices with us. And it's still evident today. If you go to Cuba, you see people of African descent practicing lukumi, which is based on Yoruba traditional spiritual practices. You can go to Brazil and see the same thing, and it's called candomblé there. And that's just a couple of examples. I don't want to get too deep into that because tonight we are talking about naming. So, in a lot of African cultures, they have naming ceremonies. Okay, they have naming ceremonies. So, depending on what day of week you were born, depending on what season you were born, depending on what major life event just happened, could dictate what name you had. For instance, if you are a Khan or from Ghana, depending if you're from Ghana and you're from, I think, the Akan or Tree ethnic group, and you're born on Saturday, then your name is Kwame, I think. I think it's Saturday means that Kwame is your name. So, depending on what day of the week you were born, if you're male or female, you're given a specific name. Now, I'm giving you an overview. I expect you as the viewer to go ahead and go deeper. Okay. If you don't believe anything that I'm saying, by all means, please go do research on your own. It's all right there. You all can Google the most inane, ridiculous stuff. Please go Google something that can help you, that can educate you. Okay. So, we know that depending on the name, the day of the week, you're given a specific name in the Khan cultures. Depending on if you're born, if the mother dies or a grandmother dies and you're in the Yoruba culture, you may be given the name Yetunde or Yejide, which means mother returns. Mother comes back. The same thing if a father or a father figure or grandfather passes away and a baby is born after that, they may name the child Baba Tunde. Okay. Father returns, or father returned. All right. So we came here to the United States with those cultural practices. And those things weren't necessarily severed immediately because we were here in the United States. You have to think about that. The first two generations, the enslaved people that were brought to the United States, and then their immediate descendants still had a very strong connection to Africa, especially if they were brought here as young adults or adults. They were had a strong connection to Africa. Why would they stop naming children in the way that they named people at home? They wouldn't necessarily. Those changes wouldn't happen until later. And I would say the more further removed we were from the source, from the root, which would be Africa and our own respective um, cultures. Now, we can't say that we completely forgot those customs because we didn't. We just incorporated them more into our current lifestyle. We incorporated them into our various religious practices. And let's talk about how this relates to hoodoo. So, hoodoo, if you will, is an amalgamation of several African spiritual systems, herbal medicine systems as well. And it is also incorporating that which we had here in the New World, meaning we may not have our sacred texts anymore or access to those sacred texts we had in Africa. So if you were Yoruba, we have a sacred, our own sacred divination system, and you would have different odus, right? And it's a binary system for divination. If you didn't have access to that, but you had access to a Bible, um, you may use the Bible and the books of the Bible to read or divine for someone. Divination is like reading, you're giving somebody a reading. You know how you all go get those tarot card readings and things like that? Well, in hoodoo, in some practices, they'll use parts of the Bible, but the mysticism and the herbalism that comes from that reading, that is given to you from that reading, is really coming from Africa, from our spiritual practices in Africa. Because if you look at the European who's using the same text, the Bible, they don't do that. They're not doing that in the way that we do that. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't just spontaneously. No, that is our cultural retention. That is us retaining our ancestral knowledge. We're just using it, using the tools that we have in front of us. In front of us. So when it comes to naming children, we have that same thing. Okay. We have that same thing. We name children based on whether or not the mother was happy, whether or not a child died prior to that child. So all of those things are cultural retentions. Now, when we get to the United States and we are here, and some of our ancestors came over and were enslaved, right? Some of us kept um, using the names of our forefathers and foremothers. So if you watched Roots, Alex Haley's Roots, you'll see that names are very important there. Remember when Toby was being beaten at the tree and they wanted him to use a slave name, and he said his name was Kunta Kinte. Now, folks love to use that as a joke, ha ha, he. But the truth of the matter is that brother stood on business. He stood on absolute business. My name is not Toby, and I will not accept the name that you have given me. I came here with a name. I came here with an identity, and I will not allow you to break my identity, to break who I am. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an excellent example of using names for self determination, using names as self determination. So, that is but one example dramatized for us in Roots, right? And I remember Roots as a child. I was a little wee girl, but I remember seeing that original with LeVar Burton. And LeVar Burton played the younger version of Kunta Kinte, okay? AKA Toby, but Kunta Kinte. Um, so we kept certain names. There are names that we have nowadays that people don't even recognize or realize have African roots. There are words in our vocabulary like okra. Okra is a West African word. You can find a similar word for that vegetable in West Africa, in Ghana in particular, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. If you're in parts of the Caribbean, especially, you hear the same things. And so what some people are saying and what has been posited is that where there were larger African populations, the retention of African words and cultural systems was greater. In the United States, approximately 10% of the population was Black and enslaved during those 400 years, give or take a few percent. Those percentages were much higher in the Caribbean and South America, particularly Brazil and the Caribbean, other parts of the Caribbean. Specifically, Jamaica and Cuba come to mind. So in Jamaica, they have folk tales, right? And they talk about Aunt Nancy. Aunt Nancy is a bastardization of the name Anansi. Anansi the spider. Anansi the spider comes from is a folk tale, a character in a folk tale that comes from Ghana. See what I mean? Like you didn't lose everything you think you lost. Now, we're not even going to get into epigenetics, okay? The kind of trauma and pain and wisdom that's passed down through your DNA. We're going to keep it right here on this surface and just say that we retained all of these other things. We retained these things in our language, in our hairstyles, in the way that we name our children. If you like what you're seeing, go ahead and press like, go ahead and share. Please do that for me. Now, um, during our enslavement, our ancestors' enslavement in the United States, we held on to those traditions of how we name children, and children were given a naming ceremony in many African cultures, and we brought those cultures and those cultural retentions here to the United States. So, um, if you think about it in this way, baptism is a form of the child naming ceremony or christening, right? You have your child dedicated to God in a church. Um, and you invite your family members and you select someone who is close to you to be the godparent of your child. That is also, while they have it in other cultures, that's also very much a part of our um, various African ethnic cultural groups. We did the same thing. It was part of a naming ceremony. In Yoruba culture, they called it Esentai, right? The child naming ceremony. It happens generally in a lot of cultures, West African cultures that I know of. It happens a certain amount of days or a certain amount of weeks after a child has been born. During this time, there's a ceremony done for the child. The family is there. The child is presented to the community, right? Um, we pray for this child. We each give this child a special name to us. Now, what do Black people love to do? Child, we're going to give that baby a nickname. Are we not going to give that baby a nickname? We all have a special name for that child. That didn't just come out of anywhere. If you go to the Caribbean, English speaking Caribbean, we call it a pet name, right? You give your baby a pet name, right? So that's why when we go to some of our Caribbean folks' funerals, they're like Suzanne, Michelle, Anne, Christy, and you're like, who is Suzanne and Christy? I called her Auntie Pinky. I didn't know Pinky's name was really Suzanne. I thought it was Michelle. Why? Because we give each other pet names. We also give each other pet names that are names that, of course, it's given out of love, right? It's meant to represent the child, our representation, our relationship with that child as well. That's very African of us. Yes. We also think about how we're going to name a child. So in older days, not so much today in modern days, but we had a lot of people who, in their enslavement and having some of their cultural, their ancestral spirituality stripped from them, they began to rely heavily on the Bible. Now, let's put a pin in that. I also want to say, along with indigenous African belief systems that we brought to the United States, there were also a fair number of African Muslims brought to the United States as well, who were enslaved, who read and wrote Arabic. And one man petitioned for his freedom, um, and won. And they showed him to be a literate man, right? And to be fair, we the rest of us were literate as well, but when they realized he was speaking and reading and writing Arabic, it impressed the Europeans who were around him, and he was able to petition for his freedom. He's not unique. A lot of um, Muslim Africans were brought to the United States enslaved as well. Okay, so we're gonna come back around to that. So you have people. who are enslaved in the United States, they do not have access to their indigenous African traditional belief systems, or they may not even have access to the Quran. So they begin to rely heavily on the Bible for spiritual sustenance, right? And began to see parallels in their struggle and the Israelite struggle, right? So we began, and let me explain something to you. On these plantations, on Sundays, they would often have church services for enslaved people, either conducted by another enslaved person or someone of the enslavers choosing. So that master of that plantation, they would choose someone, I should say, to preach to the enslaved. A lot of the sermons were about being happy with one's station in life and not committing offenses against the master. And they were um, anti-rebellion. Now, that didn't stop rebellions, mind you, but they were anti-rebellion. They were meant to pacify and to keep people subjugated, the enslaved subjugated. But many of us saw right through that. And, but because reading was outlawed, enslaved people were not allowed to read, punishable by death in some places. We relied on word of mouth, Bible stories told to us. Um, and that's when people began to name their children biblical names like Ruth, Moses, Samuel, Levi. All of those are biblical names. Even within my own family, my great grandfather's name is Mose. And he was from Bolivar County, Mississippi, Pace, Mississippi to be exact. His name was Mose, which was just sort of an interpretation of the name Moses. Mose, Mose, Mose. I talked to a friend of mine who I met working at a college here in Atlanta, and his grandfather's name is also Mose. We're not related by blood. These are just these are just names that have been passed on. And remember, we're reciting Bible. A lot of our ancestors couldn't read because they weren't allowed to read, right? Um, and so the Bible and Bible stories were told word of mouth. And you know what happens when we play telephone with one another? Things start to change. So Moses becomes Mose, Mose. Okay. So you have the boom of the biblical names, right? A spiritual name. And as many of us began to learn how to read, once we found out the meaning of those names in particular, we wanted to have our child have those names. So, again, that is a cultural retention from our African ancestors. Our names have meaning. They had meaning. Okay. So if you think about it, and I'll just use Yoruba culture as an example of a West African culture. So if we were to take the name Olufemi, Olufemi means God loves me. So Olua, God, Ife me, Ife, love me. It's a sentence. So the name Olufemi is like and forgive me if I'm oversimplifying my Yoruba people, my Yoruba linguists. But it's like you are it's almost like a contraction, like can't is a contraction for cannot, right? So Olufemi is like a contraction for Oluwafemi, okay? So God loves me. I have a baby niece. Her name is Ayomi, which means my joy. Okay. Ayo is joy. Me is mine. So her name is Ayomi, my joy. Now, as we started using more English names, names that were from the Bible and things like that, those were the first names that we were given, right? And we will also, some of us would retain our um, African languages. If you heard the name Cujo, Cujo comes from Cudjo, Cudjo, Cujo. That name in particular has been traced back to Ghana. Yeah, Cujo. Okay. Some of the names that we were given passing down through those generations have very distinct African roots. Okay, very loudly and very proudly. So, with the dissipation or ending of slavery, with the Emancipation Proclamation, um, and let me say this, on some plantations, you were allowed to name your own child, on other plantations, you were not. Remember, those enslavers, those colonizers owned you. So just like your pet can't name itself, that's exactly how you were treated. And I know that's a very hurtful thing to say, and it makes you angry, and it should make you angry that human beings were treated that way. It should make you very angry. But that is the long and short of it. That is the truth of it. So if someone looked at you, if your mother named you Iona or a form of Ayana, which is again an African name. I've seen Ayana in Ghana. I've seen Ayana in parts of the name Ayana in parts of West Africa. Different meanings, but same name, Ayana, right? Hmm. And the person enslaving your family doesn't like the name Ayana, but they're not going to call you that. If they prefer to call you Bessie, then Bessie is what you're supposed to be answering to. Remember that example I gave you from Roots. Remember that example where they called him Toby instead of his real name, which was Kunta Kinte, right? So that is the long and short of it. With the Emancipation Proclamation came the freedom to name one's self. So we had that that little bit of self-determination where we can name ourselves. Now, some of us chose the last name Friedman. Some of us chose the last name Breedlove. I know a lot of Breedloves, Cleveland, Ohio, and a lot of Black folks whose last name is Friedman. Because remember, on these plantations, we didn't have last names. We were referred to by our first name and the plantation that we came from. So my last name is Young. We do not, and what's funny is we are the only Youngs in our family. I have a big, very big family, many last names. We are the only Youngs, my brothers and I, and now their children. But formerly enslaved African Americans were given the last names of the plantations that they worked on. They either took them themselves or as they had to go and try to get jobs and things like that, and their lives had changed tremendously, you were asked what was your last name or your surname. And so many of us were either given or took on the last name of that enslaver. So that's how your last name got to be Jackson, Lee, Lewis, Nelson, okay? Young, all right? And then there were others of us who were registered with the Freedmen's Bureau and different things like that, who chose our own last names, like Freedman, Breedlove, Cujo, okay? So that's how we developed our own last names. That's how we were given last names. Now, when we talk about our first names, okay, and we talk about our first names, remember, we now have the power post enslavement to name our children what we want to name them. Okay. And we could do so without thinking about our enslavers coming by and just changing the names of our children. So we began to exercise our self determination. Many of us who were formerly enslaved, post slavery, we couldn't read. So the names that we were familiar with, of course, were the names of our loved ones and the names of the Bible that we were taught, that we listened from sermons to. So again, we have the perpetuation of those biblical names. Okay. And we began naming our children. Oh, and this is a cultural retention. We named our children also after loved ones that had gone on, that had passed on. We also gave our children the names, our sons, the names of of their fathers, right? Because we could. Those family bonds that were weakened by slavery, those families that were broken up, now we can retain those familial units. And it's an honor to name my son after his father, right? So now we have, let's say, Samuel and Samuel Jr., right? There is pride in that. There's pride in the way that we name one another, right? And as we became more and more educated, as we began to migrate out of the South and move to different parts of the United States, um, we began to, our frame of reference began to expand and our ear began, we start hearing certain names, right? So it always amazes me when I hear um, Black folks with certain names that I'm just like, this is not typically an African name, or this is an extremely European name. But I think about it in relation to the Great Migration. The Great Migration is when African Americans moved out of the South. We were where we were primarily located in those slave states, and we migrated north to places like New York, to Chicago, to Cleveland, to Detroit, even to Pittsburgh, PA. Um, Now we're around a lot of different ethnic groups. And those ethnic groups who were new immigrants to the United States, they were not accepted by their white counterparts. They weren't accepted by their white counterparts. It's true. Watch Gangs of New York. You don't believe me? Or better yet, read a book. So, those people who were new immigrants who are white coming to the United States were also often relegated to the ghettos. And the ghetto, by the way, ghetto is now associated with Black people. Thank you, Kristen. Christian, yes, Christian, thank you very much. So, when we talk about this, these people, um, the term ghetto just means a particular ethnic group that's basically all bunched together, living together. And so it's associated with Black people now, and it's a derogatory term. However, during the early 1900s, late 1800s, um, they had ghettos of every type. They had Jewish ghettos, Italian ghettos, Irish ghettos, and these people were poor. They were newly arrived immigrants, and they oftentimes lived side by side African Americans, or they lived in close proximity to one another, because segregation was also very prevalent in the North as well. Okay. I don't know why people like to think the North wasn't segregated. It was very segregated, equally as segregated as the South. Okay. So, you had people living in close proximity, and that's where we hear names like Angelo, D'Angelo. Okay. We meet people who are um, Latino from Puerto Rico who now are living in places like New York City. And we're hearing names like Juan, and different things like that. And if we like it as Black people, we are going to name our child that because we like it. We like the way it sounds. Most of us are looking for names that sound powerful. If it's a young woman or a girl we're talking about, we're looking for names that sound pretty. That's we all do that. Everybody, Black, white, other, we do that, right? And we look for names that have some sort of either cultural significance or affinity to us, or we look for a name that, you know what I'm saying, has a good vibration to it, right? It's got a ring to it. So, as we are, as collectively as Black people in the United States, as our frame of reference starts to expand, as we're around different people, as our education level increases, as we are becoming more and more literate, we're being exposed to more and more names. I had an aunt, her name is Lavinia. There was a ship named Lavinia. You have people who are being named from Greek classics and different things like that. Because again, we are being exposed to all of these things. You also have right now the commingling of classes. So within the Black culture, post slavery, all the way to, I would say, let's say the early 1930s, we had a pretty serious Black class structure. You had people who had always, their ancestors were not enslaved. You had people whose ancestors were enslaved. You had people who were mixed race, who were considered Black as well. You had, so all of these different classifications. We had our own class system. It was based on wealth, it was based on color, and it was based on ancestry. Okay. So wealth, color, and ancestry, as well as education. So let's add education into that. So that's how the African American class structure was set up. And certain names, um, and certain attributes were considered more desirable than others. These are just facts. If you don't believe me, I encourage you to read a book and look it up. Okay. So that's what we had going on here. Now, with the rise of, I would say, the Harlem Renaissance and early Pan-Africanist sort of movements, you're going to see start to see a shift in the naming of Black children. Okay. People name their children not just for people within their family or names that sounded good, they also named their children for um, leaders, people that we admired, authors, and different things that like that. So you start to get certain names become popular, and this trend, it lasts for a while. So I know quite a few African American men born in the 60s whose names are either Malcolm or Martin. My own Uncle Paul, his middle name is Martin. I know plenty of Malcolms and Martins, named after Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X in the 1960s. Um, you also have during the 1960s, for example, the 50s and the 60s, we have the civil rights movement, which leads us then also into the Black Power movements. And so, with these two movements, you have people who are again naming their children after political leaders and things like that. And you also have people who are starting to look outside of um, white powered Christianity. You have the rise of the liberation theology. And the liberation theology is Black people who are now starting to pull away from white Christian organizations and things like that. You start to see Jesus as a figure within the church, and certain churches being depicted as being brown, if not Black altogether. And you have to also look at now these movements. I'm talking about it in relations to the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. But remember, we have the founding of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which happens in the 1800s. Okay, and the fact that they added African to the title of their church, their Episcopal church, tells you right there how important African retention, cultural retention was. Um, so now we're if we're in the civil rights era and the Black Power movement, you have and one leading into the other, you have this sort of movement, a return to Africa to discover one's African identity outside of slavery. So part of that is you have a large influx of people who are now searching for their spiritual food outside of the church. You have quite a few people who are examining or exploring Islam or African traditional indigenous belief systems. My own family was a part of this sort of these movements. And so during this time, people began to choose other names for themselves and began to consider very seriously what they were going to name their children. So I would say post Malcolm X's, I would say Malcolm X encouraged a lot of Black people during this time to join the Nation of Islam. In the Nation of Islam, you were encouraged to remove your slave name. So a lot of people had the last name X. That's why his name was Malcolm X, meaning that that X was to go ahead and represent the fact that you don't know your family's ancestral name due to their enslavement in the United States. So that X was meant to be there essentially to signify that. Then you had other people who were taking on other names. Louis Farrakhan's birth name is not Farrakhan. So you can look it up. His birth name was something else. He took the last name Farrakhan, okay, which has a significant meaning, Arabic meaning. So you have that is what's happening as people are joining the Nation of Islam. People are also starting to name their children Arabic names. And those people who may not have joined the Nation of Islam, but wanted to assert their Black power and their separation from any sort of subjugation, um, physical, mental, spiritual, they also named their children Arabic names, non-English names, as part of that, as to reflect their participation in that movement. So you have a lot of people. I have cousins named Naima, Jamila, my Camila. Um, a lot of Arabic names came out of that. Fatima. Um, or Fatima, depending on where you come from. So you have an influx of these Arabic names. You also have for young men, you're going to have a lot of Rashids. Um, Let me see, Rashid, Hassan. You're going to have a lot of Akil. Um, those are all Arabic names. And then you have those of us who are born with Swahili names. Um, so you might have, my name is Naja. You have Hassani, Akili, right? There are Arabic influences there, though the meanings are slightly different. They're similar, but they're actually slightly different. Swahili being a trade language used in primarily in Eastern Africa. And I'm talking about all the way up by Kenya, all the way down to Zanzibar. That's what we're talking about, Swahili there. And so there are some Arabic influences in the languages there in Swahili. Um, so you have a lot of Black people who are starting as they are embarking on a journey of self-discovery. They themselves start changing their names and they start naming their children these cultural names um, that are not European, not white sounding or anything like that, that are distinctly different. So that was done on purpose. Remember, it was an assertion of self determination. It was, in some ways, a rebuke of cultural norms. For some people, it was signifying a complete change in their spirituality or their religion. We have a lot of African Americans who were, like I said, they were. Reverting, as some people say, or converting to Islam. You have people who are adopting traditional African belief systems, like my parents, who became Yoruba priests. They were initiated here in the United States, but the system came from Africa to Cuba through up to the United States. Um, so there you have it. So my brothers were all subsequently given Yoruba names. So we have, Ayodeji, Olufemi, we have Babatunde, we have Adelana. So my brothers and my family, we consider it an honor to perpetuate that tradition. So what we did was we began naming children in our families those names as well. I have a one of my business partners, Naima. Naima, her family is much it mirrors sort of my family with the whole naming thing. She has sisters, she's Naima, you have a Naila, you have you know what I'm saying? And so again, this was our parents' way of sort of signifying that they are revolutionary, that they are not going to perpetuate. Um, it was, I want to say this, it was all about self determination, right? And it was giving your children what we considered, or what they considered to be strong Black names. All right, strong Black names. So you have a lot of names that were actually Arabic, that Black people, and this is in the late 1960s through the 70s. Um, you had a lot of Arabic names. You had people up and down the East Coast who were given African names. Even though I grew up on the West, I mean in the Midwest, you had a few of us also who were given African names and Arabic names as well. So, especially in those communities where there are large groups of African Americans, you could sort of really see this in large groups of African Americans. You had those who were more traditional, using English sounding names, or European names. And then you had that set that was more revolutionary, Pan Africanist, and things like that. And they all started to name their children African names or Arabic names, plain and simple. And again, the Arabic names had more to do with eschewing um, white European cultural standards and European based Christianity in favor of an alternative that was not related to um, our subjugation here in the United States. Now, don't get me wrong, Arabs enslaved millions of Africans as well, and that's a whole other subject for another day. Okay, but that's what it signified here in the United States. Now, from those names, these African names and Arabic names, you had Black people adding their own funk to it, their own stink to it. So, you have us adding la to a lot of names in the early 80s. So La Keisha, La Vida, La Veda, rest in peace, La Veda, adding la to a lot of names. And that is, la means the in Spanish, right? So people were naming their kids, stuff that sounded pretty, or it sounded special. It had a ring to it. So a lot of girls' name had a lot added to it in the 1980s, late 70s, early 1980s, right? You also had during this time the rise of the Ishas, I would say. Um, Nisha, Keisha, Leisha. And again, these come from us using other names as a basis. So Alicia or Alicia. Alicia Now we're going to say we want something that sounds unique. Black people love to be unique. Like we don't want to be like everyone else. It's one of the few things that we have in this world is that self-determination. So we began to get more and more creative, giving our offspring, our children, creative names. So Lakeisha, Alicia. So we have Alicia. I have a cousin named Alicia and a cousin named Malisha. They're twins. Okay. Malisha, Alicia. All right. Um, and those Ishas kind of then turned into something else. And again, it's all about our frame of reference, widening. Beyonce, her name Beyonce is actually her family name on her mother's side. Okay, you might think, oh, they just made that up. No, her mother's last name is Beyonce. Her mother's maiden name is Beyonce. So she named her child Beyonce. All right. We have reasons for what it is that we're doing. As people in the 1980s, we had another sort of our own Black Power movement, and this was associated with hip hop music. So again, we have a second wave of the Black Power and Pan Africanist movement in the United States. Some might even say third wave, and it was associated with hip hop music. This is when hip hop music or rap music is very conscious. We're talking about the times of Public Enemy and KRS-One, BDP, Boogie Down Productions. We're talking about Poor Righteous Teachers, Arrested Development, Queen Latifah, the list goes on. These were all very conscious rappers. They rapped about self respect, they rapped about revolution, they rapped about self determination. All of these things right here, they started wearing, some of the members of these groups were members of other small intellectual and spiritual groups in the United States, like the Percenters, Moorish Science Temple, the Ansarus, Muslim, they became Muslim. Some became indigenous African spiritual practitioners. All of these things, again, were happening again late 80s, early 90s. So now we have again another trend of um, young Black people naming their children things that were not European sounding. Another rise in Swahili names. Again, we got more Hassanis, Rashids, Rashidi, Akil, Akili, more Nailas, more Najas or Naijas. Um, uh, you have that rise. You have even people who are naming their daughters after African queens that they are learning about, yeah, like Ya Asantewa. You have people naming their daughters after Yoruba deities. I've met Oshuns and I've met Yemanyas, and that's there on their birth certificate. Again, because it reflects their parents' interests. It reflects what their parents are into at that time. From there, we get more, as we are getting more into the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, um, w- we are starting to get more names that are abstract in meaning, or we get more people, the rise of names like Serenity, Faith, Honey, um, names that sound pretty. So that's what I hear a lot of now. People are talking about names, naming their children things that sound pretty. Now, as we're talking about names in the African American communities, and we're going to wrap up in just a moment here, it's important to note that there are trends within the white community as well, but there is less brouhaha over their names as it is with ours. Um, and that's because being a part of the American culture or being a minority within a white dominant space um, can cause a lot of stress amongst people of non-European descent. So that could be Black people, that can be brown people, Indian people, Asian people, wherever, from wherever. And I say that because one of the things that we think about for our children is how do we give our children the best shot in this country? We know that if our names are very ethnic sounding, people have preconceived notions, prejudices against names that don't sound like theirs. Anything that's different, especially in the United States. Can't speak for other places. I bet it's the same. But here in the United States, yes. So if you have an ethnic sounding name, you may be, in fact, dismissed from an applicant pool if you're applying for a job, or even if you're applying to go to school. And I realize that and I recognize that. However, if we're being honest with ourselves, even if you change your child's name or decide to give your child a quote unquote normal white name, John Smith, and the interview is wonderful, they get in there for the job. The moment a racist sees that John Smith is not a white John Smith, they're still going to have a problem. So at what point do we decide that we are going to, in fact, name our children something that is meaningful to us and something that is culturally um, perhaps appropriate to our child? So if you come from Ghana and you want to give your child an Akan name or an Ewe name, shouldn't you be allowed to do so? Give them a traditional name? Shouldn't you live free from, I mean, I understand, and I'm not being naive, overly naive here. What I'm saying is that we have to put our foot down at some point, because trying to assimilate and appease a racist, you can't assimilate but so much into a racist culture and society. You can't appease a racist if they already don't like you and have these prejudices. So why do you waste your time doing so? Hmm? Why? If your child grows up and hates their name, let them change it. But hell, once I have you, can't I name my child what I want them to have? Can't I do it? And I know someone's going to bring up the worst example of a name, like they named it. Somebody named a child syphilis. Somebody named a child syphilis, or somebody named a child lasagna. Those instances are completely rare. They are rare. And again, if the child grows up, hates their name, let them change their name. But it's their parents' right to give that child that name. It's part of self determination. And we have to, at some point, stop trying to appease a system that was not, and assimilate into a system that was not built for us. No, all the appeasement in the world ain't gonna mean nothing. All the assimilation in the world won't mean anything, because at the end of the day, all they see is this. And if they hate this, your name could be Mary Ellen Kirkpatrick. They won't see past this. So name your child something that you love, something that is significant to you, something that makes your heart sing, perhaps something that has cultural or ancestral meaning, right? You guys, I thank you for joining me this evening. Don't go anywhere. Growing up and never having a book in my name, looking for the name tags, and it's, everybody, you go to the amusement park and you see keychains that say Terry and Erica and Joan and Jesse and all these things, and you never see one with your name, can be the most maddening thing on earth. And the reason why I think about names is because I know my name was given to me out of love by my grandmother and out of cultural awareness, wanting to give me a name that was rooted in Africa. So I have this Swahili name, Naja, right? And my brothers all have Yoruba names. And we never had a book that really spoke to us. So you guys, I just authored this children's book, which will be released very soon. You can pre-order it on my website. Um, and Brandon, if Brandon is still there, Brandon can go ahead and put my website up. You can also look at my information. I'll put it out here for you. So it's a children's book entitled "My Name is Special and So Am I," and it's written and illustrated by me, Naja Young. And the I stands for Imani, by the way. So this is the book. And it's a way to help children feel pride in their names, feel pride in themselves, um, and to teach others also that children that have different non-European sounding names, cultural names, who have names that are designed out of love and creativity, all of these names of our children deserve respect. That is why I wrote the book, is because we need to start respecting ourselves and respecting our children. People disrespect us sometimes because we lead with disrespect toward one another. And we have to be cognizant of that. Like a boss, Bronny writes, my cousins are named Akeli, Azuri, Kobe, Tabari, and let me see, and Aika. Aika, okay, I love it. It's beautiful. That's beautiful. And like I said, as our frame of reference becomes broader as a people, as we're exposed to different cultures, Black folks love a good name because we know that names are powerful and they give us strength. Again, my children's book will be available very soon on Amazon. And it is currently available for pre-order on my website. I'll just go ahead and throw that here. If you have any questions about anything that I've said this evening, please, by all means, let me know. Um, I am a filmmaker, I am a scholar, um, and an educator, and now I'm an author. I have a book currently, not a book, I have a movie currently out on Tubi. It's the second release. My film was released in 2014 and it's called Blood First, written and directed by me, co-produced by my brother Olufemi Young and my business partner Rashid Jahad. So you see, our parents, you know, great minds think alike, and our parents were on real stuff right there. So if you want to pre-order the book, you can at my website, and I just went ahead and put that. It should be up in a moment in the comments. If you're interested in any of the creative services or want to know more about what it is that I do, because I love helping people find their creative voice either through film or through fiction. Um, Please let me know. Let me help you. I love to help. And anyway, stay blessed. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see y'all later. Peace.